Who are our greatest presidents? What lessons can the modern-day business leader learn from our 46 chiefs of state? Find out in this podcast series with Tom Fox and Richard Lummis to delve into the great and not-so-great presidents to mine their successes and failures for today's business executive.
This is Richard Lummis. I'm here with Tom Fox for another discussion on improving our leadership skills by learning from others, drawing lessons from many sources, including history, fiction, film, and business writing. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
Today we're going to continue our series on United States presidents with Ulysses S. Grant, who, of course, is probably more famous as the Civil War general on the Union side, but he also served 2 terms as the 18th president. There's a recent biography out by Ron Chernow, cleverly titled Grant, which makes an excellent doorstop, but it really isn't too long-winded. It's just that he had a fantastically eventful life. We're going to limit our discussion today to his 2 terms as president. We'll have to do another podcast covering his leadership during the Civil War. His presidency is somewhat unfairly known mainly for corruption, and I'd say it's unfair for 2 reasons. First, he was personally impeccably honest. There was never any question that he personally gained no benefit from the corruption. And secondly, his administration had a number of achievements that we'll be touching on today. Tom, you had a few topics you wanted to bring up that we can study what they can teach us about leadership. Where do you want to start?
Right. So a couple of things, just factoids, picking up on your words about his integrity. He was really listed as having the soul of integrity. And I don't think we can emphasize that enough or too much because his personal integrity was great. If you probably looked at his checkbook at any point in his life, up until the time he died, it would attest to his complete integrity, or his bank account, rather. The other thing I was very surprised to learn was at the time he ascended to the presidency, he was the youngest president ever. He was 46. Yeah. And Jack Kennedy, of course, or John F. Kennedy, became president at 43. But if you look at pictures of Grant in the war, you probably would not have thought of him in his mid-40s or early 40s when the war started. So I was very surprised at that. And then the other thing we talked about before this podcast, I think we both recognized the need to do a podcast on his military leadership. But the point you brought up, I thought was somewhat prescient, was that in many ways his presidency and his presidential leadership style was really a continuation of what he did in the military. He was much more successful, obviously, in the military, or at least publicly is believed to be much more successful. But perhaps we can loop back to that theme when we do that second podcast. But there were several, as with all U.S. presidents, there were several important things that happened. Grant came aboard, became president in one of the most momentous times in the country's history. We just had a first president who articles of impeachment had been voted out by the House of Representatives against Andrew Johnson, but Senate had declined to convict.
By one vote.
By one vote. Perhaps yet another podcast. And so we had the ongoing Reconstruction. We had civil rights. We had the enforcement acts. We had the fight against the KKK. And we had the 15th Amendment. The civil rights amendments, 13, 14, and 15. 13 ended slavery. 14 granted due process rights to all citizens. And then 15 granted the right to vote to all. And many people thought that the 15th Amendment would be enough to guarantee the freedmen the right to vote. Turns out that law was not as effective as people thought, and later laws had to be passed, and indeed a constitutional amendment further clarifying the 15th Amendment was passed under President Johnson, but it was passed under Grant. And the 1869 was a time of the first major uprising of the Ku Klux Klan. The first real instance of domestic terrorism, I think, in the United States. And Grant was remorseless in his fight. He appointed, there was a newly created Department of Justice. He appointed a Southerner to the Attorney Generalship of that department, and they prosecuted and they went after the Klan legally, not with a military solution, even though most of the states were still under reconstructed territories. So I found this to his pushing of the civil rights. I wouldn't ever say he was a radical, but I do believe that he believed in some form of equality, and I'll cite some other examples in his presidency. But he pushed through the Civil Rights Acts. He did utilize Charles Sumner and the radical Republicans with their agenda on the 15th Amendment, and like I said, the Enforcement Acts, and generally still utilizing Reconstruction. So, anything you might have learned new from this phase of his presidency?
Well, it's really a continuation of the policies he really grew into during the war. He was a big backer of the use of freed slaves as soldiers. He had a full-blooded Seneca Indian on his staff, he later appointed to a cabinet position, I believe, as Secretary of Indian Affairs. And yeah, it just seems to have been very much ahead of his time in terms of especially race relations, and as you pointed out, in his vigorous enforcement of the laws against the Klan in particular.
So you mentioned the appointment of the member of his staff, Seneca Indian, to the that was Eli Parker, to the cabinet for Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I want to talk about that specifically in a moment. But he also appointed numerous minorities to government positions. He appointed the first African American, then called black, diplomat to U.S., and I think he was somewhat embarrassed around an incident involving people of the Jewish persuasion. So he appointed more Jews to departments in the United States government than any other president had prior to that time. So he was very conscious of minorities and the need to bring them in to the government, to fully integrate the government in a way that had not been done before. And frankly, I was surprised to read about that because I had incorrectly assumed he had the same type of attitude as General Sherman did. It turned out that was not true at all. And we can talk about Sherman at a later date, but integration was not at the top of General Sherman's agenda. But that really leads to what I wanted to speak about on the third point that I found new, different, and interesting about his leadership was his Indian peace policy. So at the time he took office, there were 370 different treaties by the U.S. government with various Indian tribes. And if you think about that in terms of corporate governance documents, that is virtually impossible to not only know what you have in place and analyze it, but manage it going forward. So he set up basically the reservation system was set up under his watch. Now I recognize that is debatable on the success on that, but if you look at it in terms of the continuation or where they were in 1869 with 370 different policies, and indeed a policy of extermination in large part, I found that his policy was at least a humanitarian change. And he actively sought U.S. military to, if not peaceably engage, persuade Indians to move to reservations. And his first large success was with Civil War General O. Howard, was able to persuade the Comanche chief Cochise to move to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He was able to persuade other nations to move to what was then called the Indian Territory, now the state of Oklahoma. So it was a fairly dramatic change, I thought, from the prior policy of which there was really no policy. Once again, he nominated, or rather appointed, former General Eli Parker, a Seneca Indian, to his cabinet for the head of Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so we had further inclusion and integration on that front. So that one really struck me as something I was not aware of. Now, policy did unfortunately fall apart later in his tenure, but that may have been for other reasons that we could discuss later. So, any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, once again, I thought he was quite ahead of his time in his initial policies. As you pointed out, they subsequently fell apart for a number of reasons. Probably most importantly, the finding of gold in the Black Hills. But by today's standards, of course, he's castigated for everything he did. But I think it's a much more complicated problem than people like to think today. And and he did the best he could. And you also have to remember that he was working within the confines of a very different political system. That senators were still elected by state legislatures, and the Senate had an immense amount of power. So he was always working sort of with one hand tied behind his back in his efforts here. And certainly his policy was more enlightened than that of, say, Andrew Jackson.
Indeed. And that really brings me to one point I wanted to raise around foreign affairs, because you are correctly, I think, identified one of the major problems was that he did not have the political sway and patronage abilities that even modern U.S. presidents have, but certainly before the advent of the civil service system, senators largely controlled that, or representatives. And in the foreign affairs realm, it was a relatively quiet period for the United States. Not surprising given the million casualties that had just been incurred some 4 or 5 years previously in the Civil War. But I wanted to focus on the claims against England for the Confederate raider Alabama.
Yes.
Always been a fan of the Alabama. Great Confederate raider, settled out of Liverpool, I think.
It was built in England, but that's really the English connection to it.
And so there was a claim in the United States by the U.S. government against England for losses to what was then Union or Northern shipping, but it was in reality U.S. shipping. And there was an initial claim of $2 billion. And what I found very interesting was Grant was able to maneuver this into a arbitration or a mediation, which was resolved, and it was resolved via treaty with England. So that meant the entire Senate had to approve. And the vote, I think, was well over 50%, 40 to 15, or some very large number, supported the treaty. And this really I thought it was a great example of the political skill that Grant had that we don't often give him credit for, and lots of different moving parts here. With the U.S. government, we had the warmongers, we had the English government, we had the U.S. Senate, and kind of everyone else in between. And he was able to maneuver this to really a very successful resolution. As with all treaties with England in the 19th century, we cleaned up some minor territorial issues. Those pesky maritime provinces had popped up again on something, and that was cleaned up as well. So, but it really cemented what has become not only the special relationship between the United States and England, but also I think it's still the world's largest unguarded frontier between the United States and Canada. I don't think we are armed. There's no wall there yet, but really cemented a peace between two peoples and two countries that have, I think, formed the backbone of what has allowed the United States to become one of the great world powers.
Yeah, and the alternative proposal, other than $2 billion in gold, was that they give us Canada instead.
Right. Oh, I forgot. Yes. Continued hope for
Yes.
summering in Montreal.
So yeah, I thought that was his handling of that was remarkable. And as you pointed out, it takes 2/3 to approve a treaty. And at the time, the fact that he could marshal that sort of support was impressive.
And so really for the last point, I wanted to turn to one that was, I think, probably viewed as a negative on his presidency, and that was the gold ring. And this was the kind of crowning glory of corruption. If there was one, it reached directly into his extended family with his brother-in-law, and was basically an attempt by gold hoarders to corner the market on gold in the United States so they could drive the price up, led by Jay Gould, the financier. Unfortunately, our former friend Bunky Hunt didn't learn that lesson in the 70s when he tried to do the same with silver, but that's another story for another time. But basically, they were trying to buy up all the gold. And what they seem to have forgotten was that the largest amount of gold in the United States was actually held by the U.S. Treasury. And at some point, Grant, to I think great personal risk and great economic risk to the country, thought that the breaking of this gold ring was more important, so he ordered sale of U.S. gold reserves. And this, of course, drove the price down, and we did have a recession over this, although I think it was called not an economic lapse, but they had another term in the 19th century for recessions. But it turned out, as I said, that the scandal reached up into his brother-in-law. Numerous appointments that Grant had made had taken money from Gould, and bribery and corruption was rife within his administration. For the business leader who may be listening to this podcast, I really thought about this because it is a very, very big black stain on the Grant presidency. And here I would say this is where the modern business corporations controls come into play. That certainly trust and loyalty is an important part of every leader's toolkit, but you must trust but verify. And every financial control in place in a company will help keep your loyal friends and your loyal coworkers and those who you trust, I think, on the straight and narrow. And if there is a management override of internal controls, that can be within a management prerogative. But now, after the collapse of Enron and WorldCom, those controls have to be certified. And those financial controls have to be certified, and your financial statements have to be certified. So it's putting the onus back on the business leader, the CEO, to certify that we have effective internal controls and that we have accurate financial statements. So the fallouts that I see from economic corruption, such as the gold ring, perhaps Teapot Dome later, even for another presidency, but certainly from the gold ring and this huge stain on the Grant presidency, I see the modern business response as robust financial controls leading up literally to 2001 and Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley.
Yeah. Well, I think that's fair. And one of the themes that runs throughout Grant's life is that he was not financially sophisticated. And he suffered from being excessively trusting in people's good nature to the point of naivete. And I think the gold ring was an example. Certainly, there were other scandals in his administration. There was a whiskey ring, I believe. There was.
Was Crédit Mobilier before his time?
I think it was during his term as well. So there were just a number of them. But again, you have to set that against the times where corruption was endemic. The political machines had started to rise in the cities. Politics had become an incredibly lucrative profession with the contracts let for the building of the metropolises of New York and Chicago and so forth. And so it's in the context of the time, and given his own personal impeccable honesty, you have to feel a little bit sorry for him that he was surrounded by these crooks. So,
do you think it was inevitable that Grant would be elected president given his stature at the end of the war? It certainly had former military men be president, starting obviously with George Washington. So there's some tradition of that in the United States. But this was really through Benjamin Harrison. I think he was the last Civil War president or president who had been a serving general in the Civil War. We famously have General Sherman, who refused to run and, if elected, would refuse to serve. But do we have, and then of course we had Eisenhower after World War II. If it was inevitable that we would have a general, should he have understood his limitations and tried to have more professional people around him?
I think that's, again, to impose today's standards on into the past. Some of what was going on clearly was beyond all bounds, but a lot of what was going on had been sort of the historical norm. At some point, we're going to discuss Chester Arthur, who was notoriously corrupt going into the presidency and then turned honest during it, apparently, much to the disgust of the people who elected him. I think it was inevitable that Grant would become president. He was so lionized, and he got so much credit for winning the war, especially after the assassination of Lincoln. I think it probably was inevitable that he was going to become president. And I think it's unreasonable to have expected him to feel that his own shortcomings were disqualifying. Now, I think you have to discuss his alcoholism at some point. He was a binge alcoholic throughout his life, and his cigar smoking eventually killed him. He struggled with alcohol, and it doesn't seem to have been directly responsible for any of his failures as president, I don't think.
A fascinating character. The frailties of a human being is on display with Grant as they are as much with any other leader we've discussed. He was able to overcome many of them as a military leader. He is, in the pantheon of American leadership, not very subtle, but effective, and the right man for the right war, probably, to get that conflict ended. But as president, I would have to say a mixed bag, but much we can learn from, and actually much inspiration we can draw from.
Yeah, and I think he's a great example of someone who crossed over from the military to civilian leadership and thought that the same leadership principles applied. Eisenhower, on the other hand, I think understood the distinction. And of course, he was known as a political general, whereas Grant was much more the straightforward military guy.
Right.
So,
Well, Richard, I would heartily recommend the book. As if you're going to use it as a doorstop, please read it first. Chernow is a great author, great writer, has written some great biographies, and this one is one that we both recommend for you to take a look at going forward.
Absolutely. Well, it's Richard Lummis with Tom Fox. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast and listen in next.
Lessons for the Business Executives was recently honored by the communicators with an award of distinction for podcasts. Now, we certainly are thrilled to have received that. For a more contemporary podcast on business leadership, take a listen to Never the Same, How Business Has Changed Forever After 9/11. I know you'll enjoy it and find it extremely useful, all on the Compliance Podcast Network.